Witches, the Hat Man, and Strange Experiences. Have you ever listened to a story in the dead of night and felt like something was lurking behind you? Or maybe you caught a strange message hidden in the background. If you're brave enough, tune into this episode. Good evening. I hope everyone is enjoying these special days filled with celebrations and rest. For us Mexicans, this is the perfect time to share ghost stories and encounters with the supernatural. If you've heard any eerie or paranormal stories recently, don't hesitate to share them with us. Whatever you experience during these festivities, we want to hear about it. For today, we've got a lineup of real and unsettling tales that are as intriguing as they are different. We'll be traveling through Paraguay, making a stop in Peru, and even venturing to a small hidden house in the mountains of Guerrero. So, get comfortable, turn off the lights, and let yourself be drawn in, because you're about to enter another episode of Nighttime Stories. Paranormal story submission from Nicholas. Hello, Nighttime Stories community. I've always wanted to say that. My name is Nicholas, and I'm writing to you from Asunción, Paraguay, to share something that happened to me recently. Something I still can't quite explain. It was early Sunday morning. I had been studying at my friend Aito's house, who lives in a town far from the city center. The roads there are narrow and poorly lit. After a long night of studying, I left his house around 2 a.m., driving my small black car. The road was dark and lonely, the perfect setting to listen to your stories, which is my usual routine on these kinds of drives. But that night felt different. I was lost in thought, mentally going over everything we had studied, with some music playing softly in the background to keep me company. But then something strange happened. Suddenly, without realizing it, the intro for Nighttime Stories began playing on my car's radio. Just a note, my car doesn't have a fancy multimedia screen, just a factory-installed radio with red lights and basic Bluetooth connectivity. Strangely, I didn't remember choosing to listen to the show. I'd been playing music from a radio station, but I didn't think much of it at the time and kept driving, focusing on the road. Eventually, I got caught up in the story. I remember thinking it sounded like an older episode because the audio quality was slightly different. But I didn't dwell on it too much, as the increasingly shadowy road required more of my attention. The story was about someone driving down a lonely road, exactly like I was at that very moment. It grabbed my attention when you mentioned that the protagonist was driving a black car, just like mine. I laughed a little at the coincidence, thinking nothing of it, and kept listening. But as I continued driving, the coincidences started becoming more and more unsettling. The character in the story began describing a narrow, dark road, mentioning details that uncannily resembled my surroundings. The story continued, describing the weather, the time of night, and other small details. Eventually, you mentioned something that sent a chill down my spine. You said the driver in the story passed by a church with a blue stone wall. That same day, on my way to Ito's house, I had passed by a church with a blue wall. At that moment, I started paying much closer attention. I couldn't believe how eerily the story matched my reality. Then, the driver in the story reached a crossroads, just like the one I was approaching. You described how, after turning right, something terrible happened. The driver felt a presence. Something climbed into the car, and he was overwhelmed by a sudden, intense cold. A sensation of danger, fear, and being on the verge of death. I reached a crossroads right as this was being said. Internally, I still didn't believe it. I tried to find a logical explanation and even laughed at myself for getting worked up. I told myself I was just one of those people who get spooked easily by a story. But before I made the turn, I stopped. I was completely absorbed by what I was hearing. Something inside me told me not to take that turn. In the story, the driver had turned right and continued down the road. But I decided to go straight, choosing a rough cobblestone path that took me away from what seemed to be the same tragic fate as the character in the story. As I drove along the bumpy road, the story continued. The driver who had turned felt the presence in his car growing stronger and more oppressive, until eventually he lost control and crashed. The episode ended with the sound of the crash and the radio cutting off abruptly. Your voice, it was on my radio, or so it seemed, coming from the car speakers in complete silence. My heart was pounding hard. I thought about rewinding the story to hear it again, but I couldn't find my phone anywhere. I was sure I had it with me in the car since it was connected via Bluetooth. It was the only way to play YouTube in the car, but it wasn't there. I figured the phone must have fallen under the seat again, as it had 1,000 times before. So I calmed myself and turned off the radio. I was now heading towards a much busier road with a few cars driving by. Finally, I arrived home. I felt more confused than scared at this point. As I got out of the car, I rushed to the house because, well, I really needed to use the bathroom. That's when Eugenia, my girlfriend, crossed paths with me and said, "Oh, by the way, did you get any calls?" She wanted to let me know I had left my phone at her place. I froze. How was it possible that I was hearing your story in the car if my phone was never with me? To this day, I still don't know what I heard that night. Who or what used your voice to warn me? I don't know if it was just a coincidence that somehow your story came through some local station. But even if it was, the coincidences were too much. So I don't know if it was that, or a premonition, or something else. No matter how hard I try, I can't remember if the radio was set to Bluetooth or FM. I didn't check at the time. And well, that's my story. And Huriel, if you ever read this and share it, please don't use my name or location. Maybe then those I've told will believe me a little more when they hear you tell it. Maybe they'll trust your words and not think I'm crazy. I hope that someday I'll be able to understand what really happened that night. When my father was about 24, the country was much safer than it is now. He set off in his 3.5-ton truck in search of cattle to start his small ranch. Like many young men in the 90s who at 20 already had 2 kids, a house, a car, and a ton of skills, he had a plan. He arrived at a small community deep in the heart of the Sierra de Guerrero, going door to door, asking if anyone was willing to sell him their cows. At some point, one of the places he visited seemed quite promising. The only issue was that they'd have to travel 3 hours along a rough dirt road to reach the man's pasture, where the cattle were kept. So they set off. Once the deal was done, the man invited my father to have dinner at his home, which was nearby, nestled within the mountains. When they arrived, they were met with a small, rustic kitchen made of clay bricks, like many in the area. It was small with only a single window, and where the door should have been, there was a curtain worn thin by time. Niches carved into the thick walls held images of what seemed to be saints. But for some reason, none of the images felt familiar to my father. Instead of conveying peace, their eyes carried a strange malevolence. At the back of the room, in the dim light cast by the stove in the fading daylight, she sat. And she wasn't just tall, she was enormous, even while seated next to her spinning wheel. My father could immediately sense that she was a woman of great stature, with an imposing presence. She was older, perhaps in her 70s, with a long braid streaked with gray, draping down to her waist. Her hair, thick and abundant, was strikingly still, as if frozen in place. My father couldn't stop staring at her enormous hands as she shaped tortillas, using her bare hands to handle the firewood. He occasionally caught himself wondering how such a massive figure moved so silently. The woman seemed to shift her position without making a sound, as if she could glide from one spot to another without any effort. The woman who greeted him, alongside her husband, didn't utter a word throughout the entire meal. If you've ever felt the chilling sensation that warns you when someone is watching you with malice, you can begin to imagine the discomfort my father felt. But what truly unsettled him, breaking through his usual calm, was when he prepared to leave, well into the night. The woman finally broke her silence. She took my father's hand, looked him directly in the eyes. Her stare was devoid of any emotion. Her dark, enormous eyes had no eyelashes, and it felt like she was commanding him with her gaze. Yet her voice, in contrast, was strangely kind and gentle. "You can stay," she said. "You can spend the night here with us." My father, being a very social and approachable man, somehow managed to keep his composure, even as this towering woman held his hand and stared at him like he was prey. He politely excused himself, suppressing the instinct to flee. His gut told him that he had to leave, to drive through the night, no matter how dark the road was, until he reached a safer village. He says it was no more than an hour after he left that house when, on that moonless night, something suddenly lit up the sky. As my father drove down the dark road, he saw what appeared to be a bright light in the distance, hovering above the ground. It was as if a giant star had descended, bobbing up and down over the same spot. But he knew it wasn't a star. Whatever it was flying low, skimming the earth. He kept driving, but the light seemed to maintain the exact same distance from him, no matter how fast or slow he went. He started to wonder if his mind was playing tricks on him, if maybe he was just imagining it all out of fear. At one point, the road passed between two tall hills. It was there that the situation escalated. What he initially thought was just one strange, floating light turned out to be more. As he glanced up, he realized there were at least 3 other orbs of fire hovering in the sky, circling above his truck. They seemed to be at a considerable height, but it was clear they were following him, moving in sync. He wondered if they meant to harm him, if this was some kind of ambush. Part of him almost wished they would just get it over with, to attack him directly rather than prolong the agony. The tension was unbearable, the waiting even worse than the fear of an attack itself. Gripping the steering wheel tightly, he struggled to keep his focus on the road, trying not to veer off into the darkness. The cattle he was transporting seemed to sense something was wrong. They were restless, their anxious braying echoing through the truck, shaking the vehicle as they moved about. Then, as if the situation wasn't dire enough, his courage faltered, and inexplicably, the truck's engine suddenly died. He found himself stranded, his truck now sitting in complete darkness, with only those eerie, flickering orbs above to light the night. There wasn't a single sound, not even the chirp of a cricket, no sign of any nocturnal creature. He sat paralyzed by fear in a desolate crossing. Then, cutting through the silence, he heard them. Malicious laughter echoing his name, accusing him, taunting him. Suddenly, one of the fireballs slammed into the rear of his truck. There was no one to call, no help to ask for. Running was impossible. All he could do was check the truck's locks. They were secure, but the laughter persisted, growing louder, filling the night. The sounds tormented him, shouts and sinister giggles. At that moment, my father surrendered to fear. In his mind, he believed it was the end. He thought of his wife and daughters, the ones who had waved goodbye to him with hope as he set off on his journey. Then, glancing at the dashboard, he saw it. A small image of the Virgin Mary, the patroness of his hometown. Below it, a prayer was written. Without understanding why, he began reciting it aloud, his voice barely a whisper. Thud, then another thud, and another. He kept repeating the prayer over and over. He didn't know how much time passed, but whatever was outside, pounding on the truck, eventually stopped. Hours must have gone by. The sinister laughter drifted into the sky, fading with the approach of dawn. When the ordeal was over, exhaustion overtook him and he fell asleep. It wasn't until the bright light of noon woke him that he stirred again. He was still clutching the image of the Virgin. He felt older, drained and weaker than ever before. But the sunlight gave him a sliver of hope. It was time to check on his animals and carry on, if only just barely. The truck's bed, which had been loaded with wood, showed clear signs, marks where it had been struck. The spots where the blows landed were covered in soot. When he finally reached the nearest town, they warned him never to travel that road again, the one he had just come from. They told him those hills were full of witches. If the big one had taken a liking to him, they wouldn't forgive him for escaping. I'm 28 years old and I'm writing to you from Peru. I've been following your channel for quite some time now. I usually listen to it while I'm cooking or doing chores around the house. It really keeps me company. I'm not a very skeptical person, but at the same time, I don't jump to blame everything on the paranormal. When something strange happens, I try to find a rational explanation, and only if I can't do I consider that it might be something beyond my understanding. Sorry for the long introduction, but I felt it was necessary to give you a bit of context about my mindset while experiencing this. I wanted you to understand where I'm coming from. Since I was young, strange things have happened to me, and I have many stories that I will surely share in the future. But I want to start with this one. This happened years ago when I was still in school, and my grandmother was still with us. I grew up in a small mountain town, a beautiful place that you can walk across in no time. Despite its size, it was breathtaking, especially because of its scenic surroundings. My maternal grandmother was the only grandparent I had left, and I spent the most time with her. Back then, she had moved just 3 blocks away from my home. We didn't live together because she was a woman of the mountains, one of those tough old women who maintained her own land, cared for her chickens, and stayed active. To keep her close to her roots, my mom bought a small plot of land and built her a little house. There, my grandmother had plenty of space to raise as many animals as she wanted. She was always an independent woman, strong and determined. She didn't like anyone doing things for her. However, as the years went by, Age started to catch up with her. Slowly but surely, my poor grandmother began to lose her strength, and eventually she was confined to her bed most of the time. That's when we stepped in to take extra care of her. I, for example, started visiting her daily before heading off to school. She loved it when I helped her fall asleep. I would sit with her for a while, talking softly, and then I'd leave. Even though it was under those difficult circumstances, I'm glad I made those memories with her. In the last few months before she passed, I became her main caregiver. I handled her medication, kept track of her pills, and took care of everything she needed. And it was during that time when things started to happen. One early morning around 4 a.m., my dad woke me up to say goodbye before he left for work. He's a lawyer and some of his clients lived in other cities, so he often had to travel for work. That morning, while still in a groggy state, I woke up just enough to acknowledge him. I remember feeling heavy with sleep, but aware enough to recall everything later. As my dad was saying goodbye, he glanced over at my bedroom door, which was open, and saw something. Standing in the hallway, illuminated by the faint light, was a shadowy figure. It had a hat and was just standing there, staring at me. At first, it didn't strike me as odd. I assumed it was my mother, since she had recently started wearing a hat. My dad finished saying goodbye, and I quickly fell back asleep. Later that morning, I asked my mom if she had walked with my dad to the door to see him off. Confused, she told me that she never got out of bed and that my dad had left by himself, just like he always did. It was at that moment I realized that the figure watching me wasn't her. I won't lie, I thought she was playing a prank on me, but she sincerely assured me that she hadn't woken up, and that was just the beginning. In the days that followed, the shadowy figure with the hat started to appear more frequently. Sometimes I'd catch it out of the corner of my eye, no matter where I was. If I was alone, it was there with me, always lingering. Its presence became constant. At a certain point, I could feel it watching me regularly. Even though it never moved or approached me, I felt an overwhelming sense of fear. The heaviness of its presence was undeniable. At night, it would stand in the corner of my room, near a mirror I had. If I looked directly at the mirror, all I saw was my reflection. But whenever I turned my head slightly, I could clearly see the figure out of the corner of my eye. I never spoke to it. In fact, I pretended like I didn't see it at all, afraid that if I acknowledged it or showed fear, it might do something to me. I couldn't understand what its intentions were. I know it may not sound logical now, but at the time when I was 15, it made perfect sense to me. That shadowy figure lingered for 2 long months. I'm not sure how I managed to deal with it, but one night it simply vanished. I tried to catch a glimpse of it out of the corner of my eye again, but it was gone. Somewhere in the house, it had disappeared. The atmosphere felt lighter. I was relieved but also confused. That feeling only lasted for about 5 minutes. Around midnight, my uncle's wife, who stayed with my grandmother every night, called us in tears. She told us that my grandmother wasn't waking up, that she hadn't woken up to take her medication. And in that moment, I knew. I understood everything. Without thinking about the time, I rushed to get my mom. I threw on the first thing I could find, and we ran to my grandmother's house. When we arrived, my uncle's wife was sobbing uncontrollably. Without hesitation, I went straight to my grandmother's room. Deep down, I knew there was no going back. She no longer seemed like she was part of this world. She was gone. I approached her and held her hand. Despite everything, I could still feel her pulse, faint, but there. And then she squeezed my hand. I swear to you, she weakly squeezed it one last time. And then she was gone. I didn't want to cry because I felt like if I broke down, my mom would too. I walked out of the room and headed to my grandmother's garden, the one she loved so much. I let the cool night breeze give me the strength I needed. Suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something near the kitchen hallway. It was a faint white figure moving slowly. I turned my head to get a better look, and there it was, my grandmother's silhouette. It was impossible not to recognize her. She stood there for a moment as if she were looking at me. Then in the blink of an eye, she was gone. I know many people won't believe this, and I still can't fully explain it. But that memory remains vivid in my mind even 3 years later. I don't know if that shadow figure with the hat was some kind of omen, a warning of death or misfortune. All I know is that ever since my grandmother passed, I haven't seen it again. And to be honest, I'm afraid. I worry that one day it might return to signal something else in my life. Thank you so much for listening to my story. By the way, I want to remind you of something. If you heard anything strange during this episode, there were no special effects. I urge you to listen again. There were no voices, no screams, no whispers. I'm completely serious. Be careful when you listen to this with headphones. And most of all, be cautious when you listen at a high volume, because anything or anyone, alive or dead, could be right next to you. You just can't hear them yet. Don't look outside your window. Don't check under your bed. Just let it be. You don't want to become the next story in this series.